Hey everyone, I'm Michael Beckley. I'm the head of Asia Research at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. I'm really excited to welcome you all today for our conversation on command of commerce, America's enduring economic power advantage over China. And this is obviously a very timely topic. And the way we're going to address it today is sort of counter conventional wisdom. I think a lot of these debates about US China competition usually start from the assumption that China either is or will soon be an economic peer of the United States. But the book we're talking about today pushes back against that conventional wisdom. It says if we look carefully at where value is actually generated in the global economy, who actually has control over key aspects of the global economy, and ultimately who has more strategic leverage, that the balance actually looks very different than what you typically read in the newspaper. So I'm very pleased to be joined by one of the book's authors, Stephen Brooks, who's a professor of government at Dartmouth College. And for those of you that don't know Steve, he's been a major figure in debates over American power, over globalization, and really at the intersection of economics and geopolitics for several decades now. So he's not someone that just parachuted into the China debate. The themes in his book, how globalization affects state power, how to think about the real foundations of national strength, and why a lot of the conventional measures mislead us, that runs through his extensive scholarship going back many, many years. And so this book is in some ways a culmination of a larger body of scholarship, which makes it, I think, the novel conclusions of this book all the more valuable because they really are based on a robust understanding of all of these issues. So I'm going to be bombarding Steve with questions. You also are free to do that. If you have questions, please put them in the Q&A box and I'll work them into the discussion. But Steve, thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, it's a real pleasure to be here, and thanks for your kind words. And what I can throw back is that you, Mike, of course, have done a ton of amazing work on measuring U.S. power, and so in some respects, there's like kind of this baton passing, like I do some stuff, or Bill and I do some stuff, you do some stuff, and then we look at what you did and then improve on it. So we were very much building upon your last two books when we wrote this book.
Well, that's incredibly kind of you to say. Let's jump right in because I thought really what this book is about, it's not just who's stronger, the US and China, or what's going on with the trade wars. I mean, I think this book fundamentally reshapes how we think about power and how we measure it. You note in the book that there's all these smart people that are looking at these headline indicators, GDP, manufacturing scale, export volume, market size. And on a lot of those indicators, just by sheer gross size, China already looks like a near peer of the United States. But in this book, you shift our attention from just gross output to things like profits in certain industries or control over certain aspects of these supply chains, and what you and your co-author Ben Vagle call commercial capacity. So I guess just to kick us off, maybe explain a bit how you came to this reconceptualization, why you think things like profits are a better guide to understanding who holds geopolitical power than sheer production volume, and then ultimately what that says for the US China balance.
Sure. In keeping with your introduction, one thing I'll say is that my first book in 2005 was called Producing Security, and what it was saying is, in today's world, if you're looking at how globalization works, like, don't look at trade. Like, that's kind of an old-fashioned way of thinking about how the global economy works, because trade's there and it's important, but what's really important are multinational corporations and who they are and how they decide to organize their production activities, where they decide to place it, where they decide to put their foreign affiliates, where they decide to put their research facilities, who they decide to use as suppliers. That's what drives global commerce. So our kind of old way of thinking about commerce, which is like something's made here in country A, and then it leaves country A and ends up in country B, and then country B itself makes something in country B and then sends that to country A. Like, that's just not how basically almost anything works anymore.
Yeah, and
Any
You have this
And
example of the iPhone. I mean, you have many examples in the book,
yeah,
and you take us through industries, but you say the iPhone helps kind of illustrate this process.
yeah. So there the point is, and this kind of sets up the main thing I wanted to say in response to your first question is, given that world where multinational corporations are dividing up production and then combining things from many different countries, you can no longer look at output in territorial terms. You can no longer look at trade in territorial terms. What I always say is that if you look at what's made within the geographic borders of China, it's very, very impressive. But if you ask, what do Chinese firms make within the geographic borders of China? It's not very impressive, or certainly it doesn't look anything like what you'll read about when you see headlines in the Financial Times or the Economist, or I would say the analyses of almost all economists who themselves are still kind of trapped in that conceptual understanding of old-fashioned trade and seem to model how the economy works as if that understanding of trade is still accurate. It's not. The problem is once you bring in multinational corporations and how they're making things and how you make things in this complex way, the economic modeling that economists like just doesn't work anymore.
Yeah.
So they don't know what I'm
I was
talking
going to
about.
ask, like, so when, because I mean, this book is excellent because you really go through, you break it down into multiple different industries. You talk about which industries are more important than others. And then within those industries, you figure out, you disentangle, not just looking at where something is technically made, but who is actually controlling the IP, who controls the profits. And you have some pretty incredible findings. So just give us, obviously we can't go through every statistic in
Yeah.
the book because there's so many, but what are like the bottom line findings that I think really reshape how we view the balance of power between the US and China?
Sure. So let me just quickly, since you asked about the iPhone, I'll break that down and then go to the more aggregate. So the trick of the matter is that we know, that all this production is really complex and that basically anything that you buy that's not a simple thing will have tons of things from tons of different companies and tons of different countries in it. And so therefore saying it's made in one place is just foolish. We only do that because our trade statistics basically say, well, you need to have a country of origin and there can only be one. And so we call that the country where the product was last. And the big deal for evaluating China and the iPhone in particular is that China, specializes in the last part of the production process, which is the assembly part. It's not all that China does. For a while, it was all that China did. Now it's moving beyond in some areas, but it's still the core of what China does. And so tons of stuff like the iPhone get counted as being Chinese exports and Chinese products, even though there's not much China in them. And so for the iPhone in particular, it's a great example because it's been tracked over a very long period of time in terms of what's in it. We've gone back decades, people have been doing this. And basically, as of right now, or at least when we wrote the book, the iPhone, which counts as a $10 billion export from China and therefore contributes massively to the trade deficit that our president is obsessed about, it's not Chinese because inside it, first of all, it's obviously a US corporation that designed it, markets it, sells it. It's the one that gets all the profits. So if I'm buying, say, $1,000 iPhone, 600 of my dollars when I buy it goes to Apple as profit. The remaining 400 are the cost of the parts and components of the phone. And we didn't do this work, but a kind of company that specializes in figuring out where everything in products comes from. And we spent a lot of time talking with them. And what they determined is that 32% of the value of the parts and the components in the phone are coming from the United States. 25% are coming from South Korea, 12% are coming from Japan, and 7% from Taiwan. So where's China in this? It contributes 3.8% of the value of the parts and the components of the phone. And for the most part, it's basic, simple things. And the reason this gets so ridiculously complex is that even when analysts, are looking at this, they can get confused. And I'll just use the iPhone again as an example. I don't know if you can see it. Well, I'm sure you know what it looks like, but there was a study that came out like 5 years ago, and it said, you know what? 25% of the iPhone is Chinese, made. And what we found was like, no, it's 4%. So what's the difference? The difference is this steel case on the outside. That was by far the most important component that China was seen as contributing to the iPhone, that this previous analyst who came up with the 25% figure said. So, but when we looked at it with this firm, what we found is that no, that's this is not a Chinese product. This is not a Chinese part. The steel comes from South Korea. The machines that cut the steel come from Japanese corporations. Those Japanese cutting machines are in a Taiwanese factory that's in China. And so the only role of China in making this thing, which supposedly was a big part of what China's contribution to the iPhone was, is that there are people who are in China who press a button on a Japanese machine in a Taiwanese factory to cut a South Korean steel. So, like, you have to get that far into it to know actually what's going on at the product level. And so, to get to your other question, really, if we want to kind of add this up in any systematic way, you have to back away from looking at it in terms of products, and then you have to look at it in terms of firms. And what we did is we looked at the world's top 2,000 firms, and we asked, who are they? In what area are they producing? What are the level of profits in those different areas? And then which countries' firms earn the most in these different sectors? And the headline thing that I would say, and then I'll stop, is that in the high technology space, so if you're looking at for those 2,000 firms, those that are working in the high technology space, US firms earn 55% of total world profits. So one company, one country's firms earns 55%. Next at number two is not China, it's Japan at 7%. China's at 6%. South Korea is at about 4 or 5. And next is Taiwan at 4.5%. And so just a little asterisk there is Taiwan, 24 million people, is earning essentially 2/3 the level of profits that China is earning. Why is that? Because Taiwan has specialized in something that's really, really difficult to make, which is advanced semiconductors. Taiwan and China are kind of the opposite in that way, in that the main stuff coming out of Taiwan is really complex, really hard to make anywhere else. Most of the stuff coming out of China is basic, simple stuff that you could do anywhere. It's done in China now for convenience, but it doesn't have to be done there.
Okay, I mean that gives us a nice overview. I'm wondering if we can talk about specific sectors or industries, because when you pick up the newspaper, there's so many articles about Chinese EVs or about Chinese batteries or about how China is moving up the value chain in terms and getting down in terms of nanometers in computer chips, and they're pushing ahead in biopharma, et cetera. And so we always hear about, usually it's like the same five or six
Yeah.
industries that China, quote, dominates. And then also industrial products like shipbuilding, and then things like rare earths. And so, are there certain exceptions? Like, so this iPhone example, like how generalizable is that across all these different industries that you focus in on? Are there some where China has actually taken control of big parts of the value chain, and so is not just making, little cases and doing final assembly on the back end, and is actually like a key driver? And or is it just the fact that this is the case pretty much across all of these different industries, and explains that shocking finding that China doesn't even come in second; it comes in third behind Japan, and makes up, less than 10% of high tech profits, whereas the U.S. is more than half in the world.
Yeah, I mean, think of the list that you just went through. It's the same list we hear every time. People are like, any newspaper article you'll ever read where people want to make the case that China's doing amazing is what they'll say is China's doing amazing. How do I know? Look at electric cars, or look at batteries, or look at rare earths. Sometimes they might throw in, surveillance type electronic capacity. Like, China's awesome in those things. Like, it's the leader in those things, but those are not representative. Those are just the very tip of the iceberg where China has reached kind of globally competitive capacity in something that matters. In most of the areas that matter, it's not. It takes in other people's technology in most areas and does something to them and then ships something out, but it's not the one kind of driving the production in those areas. And then, if I were to say this to a journalist, they'd be like, but, it's so far it's mastered those five areas, but pretty soon it could do everything. That's not true. That's not true. And there are a bunch of reasons for this. One of them is most of those areas where China has succeeded, it succeeded because the state has said, I want you to do really well in this area, and I'm willing to give you as much money as you need. Sky is the limit. And the point of the matter here is that when a firm in like EVs are being prioritized and they've gotten roughly about $250 billion in state support over the past decade, like that $250 billion has to come from somewhere. It comes from the rest of the economy. So when you're saying EV, you're going to be a champion, you can make it a champion, but you're doing so by draining money and people and technology from the rest of the economy. And so the point is, there's a natural limit in the sense of you can only prioritize so many things. And so this notion that, like, yes, China's done well in EVs, and so that means it can then do great in tons of other things, that's not true for that reason. The other reason it doesn't work is because electric vehicles are actually not very complicated to make. They're not very complicated to make. They're actually much easier to make than an internal combustion engine car. Internal combustion engine car has more like 30,000 parts, whereas an EV has like 20,000 parts. Moreover, the integration of those parts in an EV is much simpler. The tolerances in terms of how well all the parts need to work together is much different. There's no way, in my view, that China could have, even if it spent $250 billion, been producing now the world's best internal combustion engine cars. That's a really complex thing. And so basically, China's done really well at kind of low complexity things like solar panels that have like 20, 30 parts, medium complexity things like electric cars, if they get state support. But for the truly complex things that are out there, like lithography machines to make advanced semiconductor chips or commercial aircraft, those kinds of things have hundreds of thousands, if not millions of parts. And there is nothing that China has ever made at that level which is any good in the sense of being world competitive. And in my sense, they won't be able to make anything like that unless they continue to be bringing in tons of technology and inputs from the rest of the world, which they don't want to do because they're trying to now be self-sufficient. And what I would say is, well, you can try to be self-sufficient, but you're never going to do well in the complex areas. You're always going to be second best.
Okay, and why are the super high tech industries the most important for national power and security? Because what some people might say is, look, whether you make computer chips or potato chips, as long as you're really good at something, you can trade. And more specifically, even in national security, I mean, rare earths is bucket chemistry, but China's been getting leverage from its dominance of rare earths. Or, EVs may be sort of medium tech, but if it's kind of the future of how we're going to be driving, does that not give China leverage in certain value chains? So, in other words, I mean, you clearly are putting a lot of emphasis on if you can't compete at the highest level, if you're not doing really well in these high tech industries, that is going to mean you're weaker from a national power perspective overall. So how does that translate from dominance in high tech to actual national power?
No, it's a terrific question, and it's one that I feel like we didn't do a good job in the book of addressing. And so, we presented this book dozens of times in DC, and what you just said is an incredibly common thing that people will say back to us, especially people from the Pentagon. And so, like, I get the response. The response, this counter argument has a lot of validity to it. It does, because China is strong in these areas. It does matter, and in some cases, like rare earths, it does give them leverage. So it's part of the ball game. And so therefore, what I don't want to be saying is either that China is not good at anything, it is good at a number of things, or that in the areas where it is good, including non-complex things, I don't want to be saying that doesn't matter. What I would say is that in the overall scheme of things, like if you were to say, what would I prefer to be dominant in? Like super complicated high technology areas or kind of basic manufacturing areas, I'd choose the super complicated high technology areas every day of the week because from an economic standpoint, that's where the real profits are. That's where the real productivity is. Like China can make solar panels and electric cars. It's not making any money from that. And so, there is a limit to the extent for which you can make things from which you make no money. China is testing that limit by the massive, massive, massive debt that it's underneath. At some point, it may reach a point where it just can't borrow anymore to make these things. So you do need at some point to make some money when you're making things, and the more complicated stuff is where the money is. Because the point of the matter is that if you're making something simple and you're making a lot of profits, then what will happen is other companies will be like, hey, they're making that simple thing. I want to make profits too. And the people will jump in and drive the profits down to zero. Long-term profits only exist if you're making something that's complex that other people can't make. So that's the answer to your question on the economic side of things. On the security side of things, um, being great in high tech is not the be all and end all. It's really, really important. And I could run through in terms of like, why it gives the US the capacity to like target things at super precise, super with great precision. Why US submarines can't be heard, whereas Chinese submarines can be heard. Why we can see the battlefield in kind of real time and execute in real time, whereas China has nothing like that capacity. So the high tech stuff clearly matters. But to your point, in some sorts of conflicts, namely a really long, drawn out kind of World War II type conflict, then having the ability, as China does, to make lots of ships is going to matter. But my counter argument to that kind of argument would be what's the likelihood that we're going to get into another World War II? I mean, like where we're losing battleships and aircraft carriers left and right, and then we're like, okay, let's rebuild them and keep fighting. I personally don't think we're going to have like a 4 year long war like that. And so I think the fact that China can build a lot more ships than us, I don't think matters very much. But in saying that, what I would say is that, I don't have a clearance and I'm not kind of a bombs and rockets type guy. So people could say maybe I'm wrong, but I think it's a mistake to think we're going to fight World War II again. And therefore, if I was, in a position, I'd rather be in the US position where you've got all this capacity to be targeting stuff and doing cyber attacks and all sorts of other things, rather than China's position where you can build a lot of ships.
Okay, well, one thing I love about your book is you don't just kind of give us the state of play and the indicators for the current sort of peacetime environment. You have different scenarios for different conflict scenarios, and that ultimately matters because that's when the rubber will really meet the road, so to speak. That's when national power will be especially pertinent. And so I'm wondering if there's a major difference. Like I could see in what I would call sort of a Cold War situation right now of these two economies becoming more competitive with each other, that if China can build a lot of ships, they can maybe make some money from that, although maybe with the subsidies they receive it's actually a net loss from a fiscal perspective. But at least in terms of just being able to produce stuff, there's economic value being generated there. What some people say is that in a hot war scenario, just like you said, that China would be able to churn out material and that great power wars tend to become protracted. And so we shouldn't just assume it's going to be this neat and tidy, splendid little war in the Taiwan Strait for a couple of weeks. It's going to spread and sprawl just like all the other great power wars did. And so China is just going to do, ironically, what the United States did to adversaries in World War I and World War II, namely, is like just churn so much more stuff out and bury them through sheer material preponderance. And now, ironically, China may have that advantage. But one thing that's always struck me and what your book seems to suggest is that even though China has this massive scale, that it's actually quite brittle because China doesn't control the entire supply chain for even something like ships or solar panels, that it actually is still highly reliant on foreign technology, or it's reliant on flows, international flows of raw materials that are probably not going to be flowing very well, like in a wartime scenario. So, can you give us a, when people, Rush Doshi and Kurt Campbell, two of the most senior officials in the foreign policy team of the Biden administration, called you out by name in their foreign affairs article, talking about how China has this massive scale and how even if the U.S. has a high tech lead, that China can just basically bury the United States. So, what would be your response to that? Is that there's just that China's massive scale is riddled with holes, or is that maybe not the right way to think about it?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. And on the Doshi Campbell thing, I mean, one thing I'll say is, do you see what I did in my last answer? I said, like, I'm not a bombs and rockets person. So I actually can't tell you very much about actually how a war would be fought and how much money would be and material would be needed. Like, that's not my expertise. The problem in this China debate is you have all sorts of people like Campbell and Doshi who really don't kind of understand sufficiently the complexity of the global economy, who are saying, hey, I'm going to wade in and tell you about China's economy and how it works and how well it's working and what role it plays in the world. They said that China dominates global supply chains. I mean, the US, its firms are the ones who dominate global supply chains. And the most of the rest of the firms that dominate them are US allies. China's a tiny, tiny slice when it comes to being at the top of the value chain. So I think what I would say there is, you have to ask yourself, like, what is the scenario that you're talking about? And do you have expertise in terms of examining that scenario? And so, what I would say is, there are hundreds of thousands of people that are modeling kind of how a military conflict between the US and China might occur. That's not my expertise. And I have no desire to kind of like duplicate or add on to the hundreds of thousands of people that are doing that work. What we did, which was unique, is that we said if there was a conflict and it led to some sort of economic cutoff between the US and China, what would happen? And what's crazy is with the hundreds of thousands of people analyzing the military dimensions of a conflict, no one in Washington, D.C. or anywhere else had examined before we did what would happen economically. It's a huge blind spot that our government has. And I think it's that blind spot which is partly contributing to the kind of mindset and approach of people like Doshi and Campbell. They're not getting the economic information they need to actually understand what's going on. But anyway, what we did is we said, okay, there's a war. It's not like commerce is just going to keep going. There's going to be some sort of disruption. And so we modeled dozens of different scenarios by which you might have the US moving towards cutting off China. It could do so by itself. It could do so with the voluntary cooperation of its allies. It could do so via distant naval blockade, in which it's preventing all other countries from being able to trade with China. And then we asked, well, what happens across these dozens of scenarios? And just in two sentences, what I can say is if the US cuts off China with other countries, then China is massively damaged. We're talking many years worth of Great Depression level pain in the sense of their GDP would be going down a minimum of 15% in the short term and as much as 51%. So in a situation like that, the idea that China is still going to be producing lots of stuff is a fantasy because I said this before, to say it again, is the way China's economy works is that it brings in tons of stuff from the outside. It adds some stuff to them. It does something and then sends it out. If that stuff's not coming in, there's not much in China that's going to be made. It's just going to grind to a halt. But the second punchline from our analysis is if we cut off China with others, either our allies or the whole world, then China is massively massively harmed, 5 to 11 times more than the United States. But if we cut off China by ourselves, unilaterally, then we're hurt basically just about as much as China. Our result shows that we would be hurt about 70% as much as China. So, we when we did this analysis, this is before Trump was elected, we thought, well, hypothetically, we should look at what happens if the US cuts off China by itself. We never thought that it would, certainly in peacetime. Now we've just tried that and it doesn't work. And it doesn't work because the US on its own has essentially no leverage over China. And so that's important and goes to some of your questions before is that we're watching the world that we see and we see the US by itself trying to take on China. In that world, our analysis shows you don't have a lot of leverage. And so therefore it looks like China's really powerful. But if the US worked with its allies, who essentially encompass like 85, 90% of the firms that you'd want to be having on your side, there's really nowhere else for China to go. We haven't seen what that world looks like because President Trump hasn't tried to work with our allies. And in previous administrations, our allies weren't ready to take on China. It's just ironic that right when our allies were like, okay, we're ready to take on China, that's when the president said, not only is China essentially an enemy, you allies are also an enemy. So it was a huge missed opportunity and can cause you, if you're looking at the world, to make it seem like, well, China seems pretty powerful. It does. And the only other thing I'll say, and perhaps can get into, is it used its rare earth weapon. That's the only weapon like that it has. There's nothing else that comes anywhere close in terms of the potency of that weapon. And in my assessment, if I'd been China, I would have not used that weapon now. I would have held it in reserve for what I would call a true crisis. And I would have kept Washington, D.C. where it was, which is with its head in the sand, pretending like the rarest thing wasn't a problem.
Mhm. Well, how vulnerable does this make the United States? Because I think the book is very convincing that the United States has incredible latent power, the wealth, the technological superiority, the profits in the high tech industries. But your point about allies, that if the US kind of tries to go it alone, that a lot of these economic weapons, the impact on the Chinese economy is going to be far less than what it would be if you get a lot of the allies, just because, as you've pointed out in multiple of your books, a lot of these industries require lots of different countries all kind of adding value at different parts of the value of the supply chain. So if you can get them all to work in tandem, like we've seen with semiconductors, the US was able to get the Netherlands and Japan and South Korea and Taiwan to participate in not only cutting China off from advanced semiconductors, but the machines and materials to make them. And so I'm wondering what you make, like how sensitive, how like do you see allies, because maybe they're also afraid of China, or maybe they're afraid of the United States, coercing them, that they are very likely to participate in any future scenario of these type of supply cutoffs? Or do you see, I mean, the way that you responded to the question right now makes it seem like the US basically shot itself in the foot and has pushed its allies away, and now there's no way that the US can really count on them, because it does seem like even if the US has all this latent capability, China's big advantage is that it can mobilize what resources it does have through a top-down mechanism. Chairman Xi says, I want to cut the United States off from rare earths, and they will do that overnight, whereas the US is trying to cut China off from all these different industries. It has to work with allies, and it seems like you're suggesting that that cooperation may not be forthcoming. So what's your view on the role that allies are likely to play in the years ahead?
Yeah, it's a fundamental, crucially important question. And you know, to be honest, when we were finishing the book, which was 2024, we were doing lots of presentations in DC, and people asked us, like, okay, well, given what you say, if what your analysis is true, like, what are the big policy implications that you think we should do? And I always said, number one is the United States needs to form an economic alliance with Japan and Taiwan and South Korea and European countries, because those countries' firms control most of what matters in the global economy. And that's an incredible amount of leverage that can be used both in peacetime and wartime. And so, and everyone was like, yeah, that makes total sense. We should form an economic alliance. And, I presented this book all overseas, for 2 months in Asia, 2 months in Europe. Yeah, let's do an economic alliance. So like that is the way to go. And so instead of taking our existing alliances and then building a kind of economic annex to them, we instead are eroding our alliances, which then would make it very hard to get any form of cooperation in peacetime. And so I do think that's a mistake. Um, the other thing I would note, though, is that in peacetime, you do need your allies to kind of sign up for this in the sense of you do need to either have them, as you were noting with semiconductors, when the US said, we don't want China to have advanced semiconductors, we don't also want it to have the machines to make them. You got very quick buy-in from Japan and South Korea, but did not get quick buy-in from the Netherlands, which is where the firm called ASML is based that makes the advanced lithography machines that are the most important machine for making semiconductors. And the Dutch were like, look, China's a huge market for us. Like, we don't want to just cut it off. And also, they're like, China's kind of far away. Like, South Korea and Japan, like maybe they want to cut China off, but they're right next to it. Like, it's really far away. But eventually, the United States was able to convince the Netherlands, basically by leveraging the fact that we had been their security provider for 8 decades and got them to go along. In peacetime, you do need other countries to say at some point, okay, I'll do it. Wartime's different. Wartime, you can say, hey, we'd really like you to do this. But if even our allies say no, we can say, well, we asked nicely, and now we're going to make you do this. And the US could make our allies do this either by using our economic tools, of which we have many, basically force people to cooperate with us, but those using those tools is costly for us and also incredibly coercive. And so therefore, the notion that if we use these tools to get our allies to cooperate with us in peacetime, we wouldn't have them as allies anymore. But in wartime, you also can literally, as we modeled, the U.S. can do a distant naval blockade, which prevents ships from going to China or leaving from China, and that's about 90% of China's trade. So wartime, we have options to make us cooperate with us, but I'm kind of hoping that we don't get into a war with China, and so therefore, the real question is, what about in peacetime? In peacetime, you're going to need the allies to want to be with you. And so for that to happen, you have to have allies and you have to be in a position where they would like to help you. And, if you're a US ally right now, I think the reasonable approach that you would take would be we'll help you, United States, when it's in our self interest to do so, you know, and a lot of European firms and even Japanese and Taiwanese firms are probably going to say in peacetime, well, I understand why you want to cut off China, but I don't see that as in my self interest to do so. We've entered a dangerous situation where instead of getting cooperation from our allies essentially by habit, we're going to have to buy it or, coerce it on a case by case basis. No leader ever wants to be in that situation, I would think. You're better off in a situation where people want to follow you and generally do follow you essentially by habit. We might still be able to get back to that. And I have some ideas on that front, but we're very quickly entering a world where peacetime cooperation from allies is going to be really difficult to get, which is really costly and will cause us to constantly be in a position of not having a lot of leverage over China.
What about so I think the Trump administration's case is, look, these allies at the end of the day don't have a lot of options. And so the things you said apply in a wartime situation actually also apply in peacetime. We can say, look, if you don't participate in these export controls, we are going to scrimp your access to the US market, which is as big as I think that of like the next five countries combined. I mean, the American market is just such a massive revenue generating machine. We also are going to maybe cut you off from the many other aspects of many other supply chains that you depend on. You make this one really great shiny thing, but we make a lot of really great shiny things. And so if you want to play that game, we'll do that. I mean, from what I understand of the semiconductor example, that's sort of what happened is that these countries said, you know what, we want to sell into China. But at the end of the day, the Americans are making it clear that this is really important to them, and we're worried that we're going to suffer economic damage otherwise. And so it seems like the Trump administration feels like they can kind of just drive this hard bargain with allies, even in a peacetime scenario. And they're also willing to throw in the security guarantee aspect of it to say, hey, we may, we're not saying we won't protect you, but maybe we aren't saying, so in other words, making it no longer that it's conditional, conditioning the hegemonic public goods that the U.S. had previously given out. So do you think that that's possible, or you seem to be implying that that's a losing game for the United States, that you might be able to wring out a few deals in the short term, but that you're ultimately going to destroy the fabric of these alliances going forward?
Yeah, so it's a you're on a roll in terms of asking awesome questions. Um, and that's a question that I get asked a lot. That's not one that we addressed in this book, but it's something that my other co-author, Bill Wolfworth, and I are now writing on. And in a nutshell, what I would say is, in the short term, I actually think the Trump administration is correct. I think in the short term that um, if we treat our allies badly, that we're not actually going to lose much cooperation. I also think in the short term that we can, leverage our security role and other roles to get cooperation from people. So I think that's true. In other words, I think that across 80 years, there's a lot of path dependency in terms of economic networks and security networks, which you can draw upon in the short term to get cooperation on your terms, and other people can be like, look, I don't have a lot of other choice here. And so in the short term, it can kind of look like, hey, we can kind of do whatever we want. And what I would say is that's probably true. That's probably true. The cost will be in the long term. You know, that's what Wolfworth and I are writing. And in a nutshell, if we keep going down this kind of road, the cost that I would see and that he would see also is we will grow less slowly over the long term. Um, the world will grow less slowly, and we will grow less slowly, in part because the world will grow less slowly. So, number one thing that you would think, a politician, and politicians would care about is how fast are we growing? And it's like we will grow more slowly. And there's a lot of reasons for why I would say that, but that's our assessment. Number two is like our allies don't have good exit options now. Not today, not 2 years from now, but like over the longer term, 5 or 10 years, like they can create not necessarily great exit options, but some exit options. And for some of them, on the security front, the exit option is going to be I'm going to get nuclear weapons. You know, I fully think that if we go down the road of causing our alliances to either die in an objective sense, like it no longer exists, like de jure dead, NATO is no longer there, or if they die in a de facto way, in which there's still a NATO on paper, but it doesn't really mean much anymore. If we end up in that world, some of our allies, perhaps a lot of them, are going to get nuclear weapons. And when they get nuclear weapons, the chances of someone having an accident or someone ending up in a conflict in which someone decides to use nuclear weapons, the chances of leakage, in which someone's new nuclear weapons stockpile gets, stolen or whatever, like all those chances go up. And so I think nuclear weapons are terrifying. And so the US has tried for 80 years to keep the number of nuclear weapon states to be low. And in fact, we've been incredibly successful at that. In the 60s, John F. Kennedy was like saying that by the 1970s, there'd be 25 nuclear weapon states. Tons of other analysts were saying the same thing. The reason we don't have dozens of nuclear weapon states, the number one reason is because the US said, I'm going to have alliances with most of the world's countries that could get nuclear weapons, and I'm going to tell them, don't have nuclear weapons because we have them. Like, the problem is, if we end up in a world of tons more nuclear weapon states and we don't like that world, which I don't think we will, we won't be able to go back. So, those are some of the kinds of costs we're talking about, like more nuclear weapons, greater chance of nuclear use, less growth. I think there'll also be a much greater chance of wars, including wars that we may want to stay out of but get drawn into. It's like, it's a terrible world. It's a terrible world to live in. The point of the matter, though, is we won't live in that world during President Trump's term. We will live in that world after it. And so it would require people, businesses, members of Congress, whoever who will still be running companies after 4 years, who will still be responsible for the US national security after 4 years, saying, hey, I know you can do this in the short term, but the long-term costs are so great that you shouldn't do this in the short term.
Okay, another sort of time frame distinction you make, and I actually think one of the most counterintuitive implications of your book is you and Ben argue that the United States should not be rushing into decoupling from China, that it actually makes sense to keep economic ties to China. So can you elaborate on that? And in addition, one of the viewers was wondering about the book Apple in China, which went into a lot of detail about how Apple invested, like a Marshall Plan worth of investment and trained up tens of thousands or maybe even hundreds of thousands of Chinese engineers and basically helped them set up this broader supply chain that not only helped China advance within the type of products that Apple was making, but really paved the way for a lot of its expansion in terms of electronics and broader industrial production. And so I'm wondering what you make of that, because that would obviously be the one key downside risk of not decoupling faster is that you allow American businesses to continue to invest heavily in China. You allow Wall Street to keep pumping liquidity and cash flow into the regime and so on and so forth. So, if you can comment a bit on first this very counterintuitive implication that you have, how it can respond to something like the incredible, evidence that this guy unearthed basically in the Apple and China book, and then this sort of last issue, which is we've talked about U.S. relations with allies and how those can be fraught. What we've seen with something like Anthropic, many other examples, obviously the U.S. has an economy built around private firms. And so while, yes, these private firms make all these wonderful things, and if the US government had like immediate control over all of those things, it could have a lot of leverage. But how, at least in a peacetime scenario, how can the United States even shape the policies of these companies in a way that's going to be strategic when a lot of them are not super gung ho about participating in certain national security endeavors or want certain conditions placed on how they do it, or basically just want to make money in China, as we're seeing with Nvidia, for example, which just wants to sell as many chips as possible, it seems like, into the China market. So I realize that's like three questions in one, but I think they all revolve around this idea of to what
Yeah.
extent should the United States be decoupling from China? And then to what extent can the United States really do so, given that there's a difference between the US government and then the private firms that are making a lot of the stuff that you want to decouple?
Yeah. So, in the book we say the US shouldn't decouple. And if I was to write the book over again, I would have said that and explained it differently in that we do stand by that and that we don't want there to be a general cutoff of China. And before I explain what we do want to do, just want to say like a general cutoff of China is going to have two really big costs for the United States. One is like we will have more inflation and less growth. You know, it does help that China is willing to make all sorts of stuff, often below cost because of its government's incentives, and then sell them to us. Um, Inflation, has been super low, for the past 30 years in significant part because we're able to buy a lot of stuff from China. So like that's going to hurt us. I mean, it's going to hurt to lose China economically. Um, and on the security side of things, what I'd say is like when I said before that if the US and its allies, cut China off, that it's going to suffer many years worth of Great Depression level pain, that's cutting China off from a world in which it is linked in to these global production networks. If we've already cut China off in peacetime, then China will end up kind of being in a similar position to Russia before the Ukraine war, which was when we cut Russia off economically, not much happened. Why is that? Because Russia was not doing what China's doing now. It was not bringing in things from the rest of the world, doing something to them and sending them out. It wasn't bringing in almost anything. And so when we stopped that flow, not much changed in Russia. So if you want to be in a position to have a significant kind of deterrent on the economic side to China, you do need to maintain a significant level of interchange. But to the second part, like a significant level of interchange doesn't mean we'll sell them whatever they want. We'll let whatever firms who want to go there do whatever they want. If a firm says, I have a great idea, I'm going to transfer massive levels of intellectual property to China and it'll help me in 2 years, but eventually it's going to create a competitor. Like, we don't have to allow that. So I would not be in favor of kind of open-ended, economic interchange with China. I think it needs some real guardrails, and I think that in 2023 and 2024, we were starting to get into a conversation of like, okay, like being completely open didn't work. It created some problems. Where do we need to close? And the initial answer was semiconductors. And that was kind of an easy thing to figure out. It's a unique product. It's uniquely important for military and economics. It's the bedrock of so many different things. So like that was an easy call. The question is, what are the other things that China should perhaps be denied access to? I don't have an answer to that question, but that's the conversation that I would like to happen. And then relatedly, I think that it's perfectly reasonable to be providing guidance to firms and perhaps, more like instructions and requirements to firms, which say two things. One is don't put all your production in China. That's too risky. It was a mistake for Apple to have 100% of its iPhones assembled in China as of 5 years ago. You don't want to do that for lots of reasons. So you should diversify. And interestingly, Apple has been diversifying away from China. Now does 75% of its iPhones are assembled in China, 25% in India. The second thing is when it comes to technology transfer, like there, it shouldn't be, I think, up to firms to just be like, we'll just decide what we want to give away. We have a government capacity which monitors inbound foreign direct investment to say like, is this coming into the U.S.? Is it a problem? We're moving in the direction of having that kind of for outward foreign direct investment. And so therefore, I think that in the future, if this mechanism was to operate properly, Apple wouldn't be able to do what it did, which was extreme in the sense of literally it's thousands of Japanese or Apple engineers going there and saying, here's how you do this, here's how you do this, here's how you do this. Like that's the kind of knowledge that they should have kept, to themselves. And I wouldn't want going to any other country. I want that kept, here in the United States. And then on the Apple and China, like super quick thing to note is that um, uh, it is one example. So that's just one thing. I don't think you can generalize very easily from that example. And the second thing to note is like there's a lot that Apple's doing in China that it's embedded there. Like that's 100% true. And if you ask Apple, like, could you just leave that all behind really easily? They'd be like, no, 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 I can't. Like, it's really important that it be there. But the status quo, whatever it is, in this case, Apple doing a lot of stuff in China, it has momentum behind it. It has reasons to not interrupt it. But that's a fundamentally different question from asking, if necessary, could Apple have all those things that are done in China done somewhere else? And the answer is, if necessary, it certainly could. It certainly could. There's nothing that's happening in China which must be there for Apple or for almost any other country. Is it costly to move it from China to some other place? Yes, it is. Do firms voluntarily want to do that before any of their competitors have done this? No. But in an environment where, say, there's a war in which the United States says to all its firms, you can't be doing business in China anymore. In that environment, Apple would leave. It would reconstitute in India and Malaysia and other places, and it would be perfectly fine in the long run. Its profits would go down temporarily, but so would everyone else's. The problem right now, and the reason why people look at Apple and they say, look, it's so important to stay in China, is they're like it's moving slowly, but it's not doing that because it can't do it. It's doing that because it doesn't want its stock price and sales to go down vis-a-vis its competitors. If it had to leave at the exact same time as everyone else, it would leave and it would say bye and would never look back.
What about China's efforts to diversify? So it's what some people say is, Chinese leader talks about dual circulation, this internal circulation, trying to build up China's self-reliance for a whole range of different products and technologies, and then to sell to a large market at home, but then also to encourage what you call the exterior circulation. So basically opening up new markets for Chinese products. And obviously something like the Belt and Road Initiative was designed in part to do that, to give out loans to many other countries around the world so they can then employ Chinese companies and buy Chinese products and really become enmeshed in China's broader ecosystem of products and fiber optic networks, et cetera. And basically, so that China can carve out sustainable market share, as well as geopolitical influence over a whole range of countries, especially at a time that the West seems increasingly hostile towards China. What do you make of China's success in doing that? And if you had to look ahead in your crystal ball, I mean, a lot of people are saying this is the emergence of new blocks, basically, in the global economy, and so a lot of people are basically drawing these lines forward and saying, we can see the United States and some of its Western allies getting closer, or not, for the reasons you've sketched out, and we can see China, harnessing itself to heartland countries like Russia, but really building out through the so-called global South, as much as I hate that
Yeah.
term. And that's where you're going to get a lot of population growth. And this is how China is going to solve its consumption problems at home, all the while becoming more self-reliant on critical technologies, et cetera. So is that not a viable solution for China? What do you make of China's efforts so far in that regard?
Um, if I was in the Chinese leadership, I would play that card. Um, I think it's the card that they have to play in the sense of they don't have a lot of other places where they could be saying, hey, how about you just kind of deal with me economically and buy stuff from me? Like, you're not going to be able to say that to Japan or South Korea or France or Germany, United States, because China doesn't yet have enough of what we need to kind of exclusively be getting it for them. The developing world or the global south, lots of different terms, all bad, that you could use. There, China does potentially have the capacity to say, how about you have a special relationship with me, and as part of that, maybe you should not deal so much with the U.S. and its firms. Like, I'm not saying they can do that, but I'm saying there's the potential for that. But what I would say is that in terms of like being something that's threatening to the United States, I really don't see that as very threatening. And that's just because of the numbers. I mean, the numbers in terms of the economic size of of the global south the global south is still really really small. It's really really small in terms of firms. It's really really small in terms of markets, And so it doesn't offer a lot in terms of, I want to make this complicated thing. I need other firms to do it. Like you're almost never needing to turn to firms from developing countries to do that. And in terms of you're making something and you're like, I want to sell this thing, like the developing world is tiny in terms of market share. Just to put this in context, what I would say is that um, one US ally, Japan, is bigger itself than its economy, than all of the economies of Africa put together. You know, to go along these lines further, you know, the key U.S. allies in Asia, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Australia, those four countries are substantially bigger economically than all of Africa and all of the Western, hemisphere, combined. So one way that I would put it is if I could somehow make a choice, or if I was the Chinese leadership and said, which would you rather have on your side economically as a partner, as someone that you could be like working with deeply? Would you rather have Japan or all of, the global South? You know, if China was smart, it would say I'd rather have Japan because Japanese firms are making tons and tons of things which cannot be made in China, which if China had access to, that would make it a far better producer, globally. So, you know, looking forward with population growth, this could all change, but we're talking, I won't see that change in my lifetime, I think. We're talking 50 or more years from now. And so I think China is doing the global South thing because it doesn't have other partners it can turn to. It's not doing it because they're great partners in the short term. It's the partners that they have available because at least before a year ago, the United States had all of the allies that you would essentially want to have, you know, on its side. And they just weren't available for China. I don't know the answer to whether any of those allies might become available. I don't see that in the short term. Long term, it could be.
Okay, well, Steve, unfortunately, we have to leave it there for now, but let me just thank you so much for coming and for talking on this book. I mean, there's so much more in the book itself and in the research you've done. We've just sort of scratched the surface here, but hopefully that's given our viewers some of the counterintuitive or provocative claims of the book. And I can guarantee when you actually get into the book, you feel much more persuaded by them. So I'd encourage folks to check it out. So thanks so much, Steve, for coming along. I'm sure I'll see you soon. And thanks to all of you for tuning in. We'll put this up on YouTube in case you came in late or had to leave early. But thanks so much for Stephen Brooks, and we'll see you guys around. Take care.
Yeah, thank you very much. Your questions were excellent, and I really appreciated them. And the only other thing I'll say is I come from the standpoint of social science, which says you should make claims which are strong and falsifiable. And that's my perspective. I could have couched much of what I said in kind of weaker language, but it would have been unfalsifiable. And I don't think that would be very helpful. So my strength in part comes from my kind of scientific strength in my claims comes from my scientific predilections.
I love it. Well, it also makes for better podcasts and webinars too. So thanks for not mincing words and on the one hand, on the other. Let's just tell us what you think. So I appreciate that
Probably,
candidness.
likely.
Yeah. No, 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 no. Tell it how it is. All right. Thanks so much. Bye, everyone.